Hello, everyone. My name is Marie DeMarco. I go by pronouns she, her, and I am a health educator and medical advocacy coordinator at Physicians for Social Responsibility, Pennsylvania. I am pleased to be here with all of you today to discuss the Inflation Reduction Act. Our mission at PSRPA is to promote socially and environmentally responsible practices that support and promote the health of all Pennsylvanians. Our programs focus on the environmental health, climate change, building electrification, and violence prevention. Before we start the discussion, please feel free to share your name, pronouns, where you are from, and what organization you are with in the chat. As we know, the Inflation Reduction Act is designed to reduce dependence on fossil fuels, impose penalties on those who emit methane, and to promote the cleanup of heavily polluted sites. Today, our guests are going to discuss how important this legislation will be on the impact of the health of Pennsylvania residents, the processes for implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, and how we can make sure the implementation benefits all residents. It is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for today. Julie Becker is a senior public health scholar and climate change advisor, as well as a PSRPA board member. Prior to this, she was an associate professor at a small STEM university in Philadelphia, PA. Dr. Becker has focused almost 3 decades of programmatic scholarship on environmental health as part of core disciplines of public health. Currently, Dr. Becker's research interests include developing climate change curriculum for current and future healthcare professionals and creating programs for older adults about preparedness for climate change events. Chyung is a senior campaign manager for the State House to White House initiative at Centers for American Progress. As a member of the Indiana House of Representatives, Chris has served on committees for the Veterans Affairs and Public Safety, Roads and Transportation, and Financial Institutions. Chris is also a ranking minority member of the Local Government Committee. Just for a few housekeeping items for the rest of the webinar, please feel free to share any comments or resources in the chat and use the Q&A function for any questions. And we're going to hold all questions until the end of discussion. And I would just like to thank everyone for being here again today. And another big thank you to our amazing speakers today. I will now hand it off to Julie to kick off today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. And thanks to Tanya, Jake, and Chris for giving me the opportunity to kind of talk about this. As Marie was saying, the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of things that can influence climate change. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to make the links between climate change and a combination of both public health as well as specific diseases. So I'm going to start with the question, how will the IRA affect health? Well, it's going to affect health from 2 vantage points. One, it's going to reduce disease triggers by decreasing pollution. And from a public health perspective, it is going to have a positive influence on the social determinants of health. Really quickly, social determinants of health are the conditions where people live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health outcomes and risks. Very often, the social determinants of health contribute to 80% of the health outcomes, with the number 1 factor being your zip code regarding the social determinants. So there are 4 key areas that the IRA takes a look at and addresses: clean energy transition, clean transportation, land and sea management, and environmental justice. I'm going to kind of walk us through each one of those so that we get an opportunity to see the linkage between what the policy is going to be or what the implementation is going to be, and how does that impact upon health. So first, when we talk about an energy transition, we're talking about electrifying homes. And basically, when we go ahead and do that, we're talking about changing over a number of appliances from gas to electric. For example, gas stoves and water heaters are common appliances that use natural gas. Gas stoves are likely to emit nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide, as well as formaldehyde. But it's the nitrogen dioxide that is the area of concern because EPA has defined that gas as a toxic one. And it triggers breathing problems for people with asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. What the IRA does go ahead and do, it creates a opportunity for people to receive up to $14,000 for home energy upgrades, including $8,000 to have a heat pump installed. Next, if we want to talk about other ways about emissions, it has to do with methane emissions. Methane is the primary component of natural gas, which can be used as either fuel or as feedstock for the chemical industry. It is a potent greenhouse gas with a global warming potential 25 times greater than carbon dioxide. So how does it get in the atmosphere? Well, it's two key ways. One, enteric fermentation or belching from livestock, and natural gas through drilling and extraction activities. For right now, we're going to focus just on the natural gas because we're in Pennsylvania and it's sort of a big issue in Pennsylvania. So as natural gas travels through its interconnected systems, we learn that they often too have to get rid of the excess of natural gas, and that is released into the atmosphere in four key ways. One, intentional venting from equipment. Two, unintentional equipment leaks. Three, routine maintenance of equipment. And four, flaring or burning of excess natural gas at the production site. What is being proposed is that a charge for methane emissions generated by gas and oil facilities will occur and will rise each year, prompting the industry to lower its emissions in order to decrease their costs. Reducing methane can have a tremendous effect upon health, especially for those who live near a site that goes ahead and has high levels of methane emissions. So some of the things that we can notice is that people will have speech, blurred vision, memory loss, nausea, or vomiting. And in severe cases, it can cause breathing and heart rate issues as well as balance. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and give clean energy a chance to expand beyond the few people who have been able to take advantage of it so far. So how are they doing that? One is to lower energy costs. That's going to have a major impact from a broader public health perspective, and specifically from the social determinants of health. Two, individuals can go ahead and get a 30% tax credit for installing residential solar panels, using cleaner energy, less pollution for both air and water, which means less respiratory and heart problems. And lastly, to kind of go ahead and approach it not only just from the residential, but from a community perspective, so that there's a way in which for communities to band together and get community solar. Again, it's another way to get accessible, renewable energy and to decrease pollution. The next area that we're going to talk about is clean transportation. So again, I'm going to kind of break it down. What is going to happen for an individual, what's going to happen on a bigger scale, and what's going to happen on an even bigger scale. So on an individual scale, people can get a $7,500 rebate if they purchase an electric car. Why is that important? Well, the vast majority of greenhouse gases occurs through transportation, and cars are the primary source of it. So if we go ahead and change over our fossil fuel cars to electric cars, we are then creating less pollution, and it will have less effect on respiratory and cardiac issues. The other way in which to do that is to promote larger vehicles with electric powering. So for example, we're looking at electrifying school buses, transit buses, garbage and postal trucks, and other heavy duty vehicles used in different communities and used on the highways. Again, that is going to decrease air pollution, and therefore it's going to decrease very specific types of respiratory issues like asthma. And lastly, when we bring things into the country or we import things from other countries, the ports are very, very energy, have a lot of energy use. And so what the IRA is designed to do is to provide an opportunity for the ports to use clean energy. Again, both for unloading and loading ships, and also to moving containers from the ship to trucks that hopefully will be electrified and therefore can leave the area. Once again, our goal is to decrease pollution and therefore decrease both respiratory and heart conditions. The next thing has to do with land and sea. And one of the things that is proposed in the IRA is to increase sustainable agriculture practices like crop rotation, cover crops, water conservation, soil nutrient management, and integrated pest management. If we go ahead and were to implement more sustainable agricultural practices, we're going to have a decrease in air and water pollution, less respiratory and heart effects, decreased exposure to potential carcinogens, and increase in potable water. The second way to look at it from a land and sea perspective has to do with protecting mature and old growth forests. They absorb more carbon dioxide, they act as a sink, which means less pollution. And the other thing that it adds as well is when we're exposed to green space, it improves our mental health, and it also reflects upon the other social determinants of health. Lastly, to protect and restore coastal communities and ecosystems. In order, again, to absorb more carbon dioxide, it acts as a natural barrier for extreme weather events, creating an opportunity to have less pollution and to improve mental health, as well as some of the other social determinants of health. And last but not least is environmental justice. So the IRA is looking at it from several different perspectives. One, it's creating an opportunity for communities to monitor themselves, to find out what is in their air. And there are specific funds for both schools and those living near polluting industries, like for a waste management plan. And the goal is to identify what's going on and find solutions that have less air and land pollution. Again, it will have an impact specifically on issues related to respiratory, cardiac, and cancer diseases. The second way to restore a sense of justice to this is community-led projects. These are projects for areas that have notoriously been known to have major issues with regard to pollution, and having the community help to lead those particular projects. And lastly, the reinstatement of the Superfund tax. And the reason is that the industry has sort of deferred and kind of fobbed off who pays for it. So our goal with the Superfund tax is to get industry to pay for both the cleanup of their pollution and as well as any damages that occur. This again is going to have a direct health effect on respiratory, cardiac, and cancer illnesses. So if I were to kind of like sum all this up, is that the IRA is definitely designed for reducing issues related to climate change, but it has major health consequences, primarily in two key areas. One is in reduction of disease triggers, and two is to improve the social determinants of health on a broader, bigger scale at a public health level. And at this point, Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, and now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Chyung.
Thanks, Marie, and thank you to Physicians for Social Responsibility for inviting Dr. Becker and myself on today. We're really excited about the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the highlights that Dr. Becker highlighted in her portion of the presentation on how this can really be a game changer. It's our firm belief at the Center for American Progress that the Inflation Reduction Act has the potential to change the course of human history, quite frankly. If states and local governments and tribal governments as well implement this in the most ambitious and highest return on investment way possible, then we can really do some good things. And I'm hoping that the folks on this call today at the Pennsylvania chapter of PSR can take some of these lessons home, and hopefully we can serve as a resource for one another. So I'm working off of this GDoc that I've put together with some hyperlinks that hopefully can serve as a resource after this call, and you can dig deeper into it later. Please don't feel overwhelmed by all of the hyperlinks there. But as Dr. Becker broke out in her presentation of the 4 main areas of clean energy, clean transportation, land and sea management, and environmental justice, that's how we're going to break down various programs of the IRA that we decided to cherry pick here to highlight today. So first, as you might be aware, the White House released this resource on how to engage with Treasury on clean energy tax incentives, which make up a huge and significant portion of the Inflation Reduction Act and how we're actually going to get to the emissions reductions that we need to by 2030. The request for information period, Treasury notice period rather, ends tomorrow. So no worries if you haven't submitted your comment to the US Treasury Department, but it's more so, I guess, a signal for those on this call that the Treasury Department and the White House are listening closely to feedback for how exactly the nuances of these important tax credits are going to be implemented. And they've been really beefed up. They've been made permanent for the next 10 years. Normally, they've been passed in fits and starts, and they've expired, and the industry has had a lot of uncertainty as to if they would remain. So this certainty is a huge deal from the administration and from Congress. Next, as Dr. Becker was alluding to, changing appliances in your homes from gas to electric is another huge portion of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I have this resource here that I included from the National Association of State Energy Officials, who recently convened at their annual meeting that I was also at. They've provided these resources around an IRA resource hub for various state energy offices, and then also a summary of residential energy efficiency and electrification provisions. So the credits that we're talking about here that will give you money to replace your gas stove or water heater or whatever with an electrified and more efficient version are going to be largely run through state energy offices. So make sure you're in touch with the Pennsylvania State Energy Office and get to know your officials there. Don't be afraid to ask any questions. And as a call to action, you can urge your state legislators and state energy offices to prioritize climate, equity, health, and justice across these rebate programs as they get implemented. Last, under this category, we decided to highlight the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is also referred to as a green bank. Right now, there's an outstanding request for information from the EPA and a series of national listening sessions. One is coming up, the next one is on November 9th from 7 to 9 p.m. and it's in that link that's included in this GDoc. And we wanted to highlight the action that's happening in the state of Pennsylvania. There is a green bank that is, I think, still in the process of being set up, according to our friends at the U.S. Climate Alliance, who have been in touch with Governor Wolf's office. And there's also the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation, which aims to provide some of this financing for residential solar and things like that. One thing that you can do as advocates on this call and armed with this knowledge is to, again, urge your state legislators, but also your governor for both swift action on green banks and robust capitalization of banks. And moving on to clean transportation, I think I'm being a little sluggish on my presentation, so I'll speed it up. I apologize. As Dr. Becker mentioned, there's huge opportunity in the Inflation Reduction Act for ports to decarbonize and get access to billions of dollars in funding. So you can urge your governments, port authorities, community advocates to apply. And yes, sorry, I'm seeing the chat now. The GDoc that I'm reading off of and that I hope can serve as a resource is just popped into the chat. So feel free to do with it what you desire. In addition to the opportunity for ports, school transportation is a huge factor as well. As we know, some of these school buses are really heavy emitters and they're right in the faces of young kids who are getting onto school buses, and they take predetermined routes almost all the time. So they're perfect candidates for moving to electric vehicles because of that nature. So the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure law, provides myriad funding opportunities for school bus electrification. And the EPA has provided a link that I've hyperlinked here that awards of awardees to this Clean School Bus program for rebates, as well as a list of waitlisted school districts. So take a look. If you see your local school district in either the awarded or waitlisted category, urge them for swift action. And if you don't see your school district, feel free to voice your concern at school board meetings. It's your full right to urge members of your elected school board to consider this funding, consider this rebate program, and the myriad benefits that can accompany them. And last, under the clean transportation category, as Dr. Becker mentioned, the EV tax credits, electric vehicle tax credits, are a significant portion of the Inflation Reduction Act and how we'll incentivize a switch over from internal combustion vehicles to electric zero emission ones. There's a link here that I included of state and local governments and utilities even that have provided their own incentives, whether they're for electric vehicles themselves or the electric vehicle charging in your home. So if you see your municipality or where you live, it doesn't have a program, then it's something you can do to engage with your state and city council and utility leaders in your community for action on that front to beef up those incentives as well. Moving on, the land and sea management portion that was referenced, we've highlighted two programs here. One is the Coastal Resilience Funding through NOAA, which applies for any coastal, Gulf, or Great Lakes states. And I had to honestly look up before if Pennsylvania was a member of the Great Lakes states, and you do have a little bit of that borders one of the Great Lakes. Kind of similar to where I'm from in Indiana, we only have a little bit of coastline there, but that does make the state eligible for some of this $2.6 billion in funding for coastal resilience, and that is intended to be community-led in a lot of ways. The other two programs we decided to highlight were the Forest Legacy and Urban and Community Forestry Assistance Programs, which aim to incentivize tree planting and reduce the urban heat island effect for the latter. And a lot of those forests can be carbon sinks, as you well know. And eligible recipients include state agencies, local government entities, tribes, or nonprofits. So if you engage with any of those groups, make sure that they're looking at this funding. And these programs are in existence. They're not brand new, unlike other programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. So they don't need to be stood up. There's already information out there that I've included in these hyperlinks. And feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions on those. Last, on the environmental justice section, the two programs that we've highlighted here are the environmental justice block grants. Eligible entities I've included below. It's mainly geared towards non-governmental institutions. So partnerships between government institutions, but also a community-based nonprofit. Those are the main targets. And if you're in a state where you're skeptical that your legislators or your legislature is amenable to environmental justice funding, make sure you talk to your community groups and the folks on the ground to tap some of this funding, because it's really intended for some of those states where the legislatures might be more hostile. And then last, there's a program on climate pollution reduction grants that's also called greenhouse gas air pollution plans and implementation grants. You'll realize that a lot of these programs start to sound the same a little bit after a while, and they're still working on the structure of that, but stay tuned for more information. And again, eligible entities include states, air pollution control agencies, municipalities, and tribes. So keep your eyes open from whatever EPA is going to release in terms of information in the future. And last, I won't go through these next sections in this document at the bottom, but I included some Pennsylvania specific links from some listservs that I'm on. It looks like Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light has an event coming up soon. A Reimagine Appalachia has a priorities survey and a webinar that are both geared towards Pennsylvania, one being in Allegheny County on November 15th. So feel free to engage with those NGOs. And then at the very last, I included a list of external resources, some from the Center for American Progress, where I work, including other reports on implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I hope this information can be useful. And again, we're happy to answer any questions. And with that, I'll hand it back to Marie.
Actually, it's Tanya here. It seems we have a couple of questions for you, Chris, and I just want to remind people, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. One of the questions that we had was about getting a credit to replace your gas stove, which you did answer, but would things like a gas grill be applicable to this as well? Or are we not going that far? Do you know?
That's a good question. I think not, but I'd have to double check to be confident. I think it's stoves and ranges.
Okay. Also, you both talked about electric cars. And I've heard some rumors that there's some kind of strict rules to how you can get credit for your electric car. One of the things that I had heard was that all components of the car had to be made in the United States. Do you know if this is true? Because then we should probably be looking for very specific vehicles.
Yeah, so right now, I believe the US Treasury Department has a request for information out on some of these critical minerals and domestic sourcing mandates that were in the law. I think it's still being worked through. There's even an international trade component because a lot of car parts are made overseas but assembled in the United States. And how exactly does that count in terms of the accounting? And then in addition, there are new caps on the price of the MSRP of the vehicle itself, as well as income caps on who is eligible. So it has been made a little bit more complicated, quite frankly, if I'm to say so myself, than what it was prior. But it's also at the same time expanded a little bit too, because prior Tesla and GM were no longer eligible for electric vehicle credits because they hit a production cap, but now they're looped back in to the credit. I would say stay tuned on the guidance for this. I think if you plan to buy a vehicle in 2022, that guidance is all set and you just Google US Treasury and electric vehicle credit and it'll show you all the models and all the amounts that they're eligible for. But then the regime will change in 2023. So stay tuned for that guidance later.
Thank you. Another question that came in, are these programs that you're discussing and recommendations for action equally applicable to other states?
Equally applicable in what way, I guess?
Well, let me see. Here's more. It says for Dr. Becker, Mr. Chyung, PSR is very active on building electrification, promoting the transition from gas burning appliances to electric alternatives. It's great that the IRA makes credits available to individuals who purchase heat pumps and induction cooktops. Is there a way to leverage those incentives to get the state government a little more favorable on this transition?
Yeah, there definitely is. And that was part of what I was trying to get at, but I guess I was not communicating it very well. There are definitely incentives at the state and local and even utility level. For instance, I know my utility, NIPSCO, back in Indiana, where I'm originally from, does offer incentives for electrification separately from any government or any law. They will offer a small rebate if you move to either a more efficient appliance or to an electrified one. So, and you can, there should definitely be motivation for state legislatures, for utilities, for local governments to raise that level of ambition, stacking incentives together, totally within the realm of possibility. For when the state energy offices get the rebate programs out for home electrification and efficiency programs and the $9 billion that I referenced in the second sub-bullet, that can definitely be raised in terms of ambition, making sure you're targeting some of the low income communities that need it most, not just, you know, some millionaire who's replacing an expensive gas stove with an expensive electric stove. They're not exactly the ones who need it the most. So yeah, absolutely. Your imagination can run wild.
I want to just weigh in. So in Philadelphia, we have kind of a unique situation because our gas company is owned by the city. And so there has not been the same level of, shall we say, stewardship or incentivizing folks to shift from gas to electric. And that's something that we're going to have to work harder in order to get in just locally in Philadelphia. But it can be broadened to the sense that if your utility company is owned by a municipality, then you're going to have to kind of rejigger how you're going to think about this.
A question for you, Dr. Becker. What do you think are the best ways to get more physicians active in advocating for clean energy?
I think one of the things I've learned in teaching in a medical school with Dr. Pune Saberi, they have to feel comfortable with a certain amount of knowledge. And so I kind of feel like if there was a cheat sheet and if there was a grand rounds, people would feel a whole lot more comfortable with being able to talk about how to make the link between health effects and clean energy going forward.
Another question, do states have the power to favor certain technologies in the application of residential efficiency rebates? Let's say prioritizing highly efficient gas stoves over electric stoves.
That is a phenomenal question, and I can say I don't have the answer off the top of my head. Let me try to look it up in the next few minutes and return back to that.
A question that I had, you had talked about talking to the state energy office. When these rebates are being implemented, do all state offices have to have similar looking rebate programs, and do they all kick off at the same time?
I believe just similar to the extent that the Inflation Reduction Act itself has these stipulations. I think from just my surface level understanding of going to the National Association of State Energy Officials annual meeting and listening to them, there is going to be some flexibility that can be built in. For instance, some of the more climate ambitious states are going to raise their or be able to raise their own ambition over some of the laggard states. So but then that's where the advocacy community comes in my view, and groups like PSR and others in your coalitions will really have to lean on state legislators as they're appropriating this federal money and on those state energy offices themselves to not slip back down into reducing their ambitions.
Also, too, like for example, some of the EJ money, I think it's block grant money, if I'm not mistaken. And so that gives you a lot of latitude, and the states can then kind of go ahead and configure what they want to have happen.
And speaking of EJ communities, I actually had another question for you, Dr. Becker. How can we get EJ communities actively involved in seeking these rebates and making sure that they're going back to the community? I know we, as an organization, that's part of our responsibility, but do you have suggestions?
One, in the past, when I've worked in communities, I work directly with groups that are trusted within the community. So it's sort of almost like a train the trainer kind of program. But to some extent, it really boils down to having good relationships with other folks. So you are more of a content provider. They are more of the implementation types of folks. And having those types of connections are very important in terms of getting more folks active in this particular area.
Thank you. If there's any last questions, I would ask that you throw them in the chat before we go. We do have one that came in. Is it good to have the state of Pennsylvania configuring what happens with the EJ block funds? And how can residents have input to be sure the funds go to actual communities and community organizations?
That's a really good question, because It's the old saying of sometimes these types of grants make for strange bedfellows. And so I think it's very important to use a strategy of community participatory action. And that is going to be a really tough sell, and especially because most state folks are not going to know who's who and who's really partnering with whom. I've, in work that I've done previously on violence prevention and working in community settings, it had to be very carefully crafted as to the different roles of what the academic folks were doing and what the community folks were doing. And really, we have to follow the lead of the community folks. And I think that that's important to do. I'm not sure how to get the legislatures to go ahead and do that.
I'll also add, I agree with you, Dr. Becker. The challenge here is making sure that it gets the communities that need it, as everyone understands. But with the EJ block grants in particular, off the record, basically, even though I know I'm saying this on a public call, but those were really designed to get around some of the hostile state legislatures. There needed to be a pot of climate money that was, you know, if you're in a very, very climate antagonist state, that's never going to believe climate change in any way, and that kind of thing. These EJ block grants are specifically designed for nonprofit and community-based nonprofits and partnerships of those community-based nonprofits to tap that funding. This funding, this billions of dollars in funding, I think it's $3 billion total in EJ block grants, is not eligible for government entities in itself by themselves. Government entities can partner with community-based nonprofits, but the community-based nonprofit comes front and center.
And that's going to be difficult too, because let's say, for example, you want to partner with a group and you're an academic institution. Academic institutions have very, very high overheads, which nonprofits do not. And as to who is going to be driving this, that's going to be a major issue.
We do have a question about critiques you may have of the IRA. Can you speak to that?
I definitely have some critiques about the IRA. Well, it's sort of like you give with one hand and you take with the other. So for example, you know, we're trying to do all this kind of work to reduce our fossil fuel emissions. However, we've opened up lands for fossil fuel drilling, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because that's just creating more of the same and we're trying to move away from it. But it was a political compromise, and it'll be interesting. The last time they opened up some of the lands, there were very few people who actually bid upon them, so it wasn't quite as significant as others. But given the fact that OPEC and the Ukrainian sources of oil, or the Russian sources of oil, are limited, there may be more people who are interested to bid on this. The problem is it's going to take many years before you see somebody start drilling and actually see gas or oil appear with at the consumer level. But that's one of the key things I would definitely say. And Chris, what would you say?
I would agree with you. The most, I guess, odious part of the IRA is exactly what you highlighted on the leasing provisions. There's like this 1-for-1 as you bring online offshore wind and things, you have to do like a 1-for-1 leasing of oil and gas, which is just nonsensical. But it just, you know, in theory, I guess it sounds nice to certain legislators who had to vote on this, but is, in our view, is just not that productive. So we'll be anticipating in future legislative fights, and please, for the folks on this call, engage with your members of Congress in Pennsylvania, or if you're from another state as well. There might be some more permitting language that comes up in the lame duck session after the midterm elections to loosen up some of the requirements for permitting both renewables and oil and gas projects. So just keep your ears tuned to the ground and make sure you're engaging with those community groups that are going to be most impacted.
Dr. Katayir also mentions blue hydrogen and how that will require an acceleration of fracking in Pennsylvania. And as we all know, Governor Wolf just signed that bill today that will increase fracking in Pennsylvania. So obviously, those of us who live here in this state need to work a little bit harder as far as getting some of these rebates in the hands of folks that can make a difference. Any closing thoughts?
I wanted to go back to the earlier question on prioritizing certain technologies and residential energy efficiency. So in the law itself, the language is very clear about the dollar amount of the credit or the percentage basis that you can get a rebate for, whether you're doing an electrification or an energy efficiency project in your home. That's not to say, though, that a really terrible legislature can pass bad policy and, do something on the flip side to incentivize gas, for instance. I mean, we're seeing kind of in that same vein, we're seeing this battle across the country in various legislatures that we're tracking at CAP, that certain communities, more forward-thinking communities, are banning new natural gas hookups in new residential construction, for instance. They're demanding that apartment buildings and new subdivisions all go electric instead. But then as a response to that, some of the more conservative legislatures are trying to ban the bans and do some preempting of those local governments. So we're going to continue to see some of those legislative battles, I think, and a lot of it's industry on one side and other environmental groups on the other side. And it's not just happening in one state or the other. It's happening all over. It's happening where I'm from in the state of Indiana. And there's a possibility at the state level to reverse some of the gains that the Inflation Reduction Act is putting on the table. But again, it's on all of the advocacy community to push back on those.
And if we go ahead and try to reverse some of those gains, that is going to have a major impact again on decreasing the amount of health effects that we currently are expecting to get from the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a measure of vigilance that we really have to participate in, because we can't necessarily trust the legislatures to necessarily adhere to both the spirit and the letter of the law.
I would 100% agree. It's our responsibility to pay attention to what's happening so that we can have a rapid response whenever we feel like there's policies or bills that are affecting the good pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I thank you all for your feedback. If there's no other questions, I would like to thank you both for being here and having this conversation with us. I believe that you've shared some great resources. There's others that we'll send out to folks after this, along with the recording if you joined late. And with that, I'd like to say thank you from PSR Pennsylvania to our speakers and to our attendees. Have a good afternoon.